think it's about time I upset a bunch more people.
Hello everybody. How you doing? Sorry for a bit of a hiatus in my old bugger Amiga. Surely that's not right. I'm sure it was the 12 days of Amiga, but oh well, the best of laid plans. Yes, been a bit of a hiatus because at the start of January I received some slightly less than great news about the recovery of my broken wrist. Thankfully it turned out it was all a bit of a mistranslation, and what was described as not healing correctly was in fact my wrist was healing correctly, just slower than the doctors expected. So I've just been engaged with a few other bits and pieces in the meantime, and I'm just going to crack on and finish the last 4 models of Amiga in this series. So, I just want to remind you, have a look in the video description. It explains how I'm personally ranking the Amiga systems. I'm not trying to say that an Amiga from 1987 is really rubbish compared to an i7 PC because it's really slow. That would be madness. Nor am I trying to compare, say for example, an Amiga 3000 in 1990 to a souped up Amiga 500 in 2023 in specs alone. I'm just trying to add a little bit of nuance to the popular YouTube sort of opinions that, oh, the Amiga 3000, it's the best Amiga ever. And obviously having owned one myself back in the day, 20 plus years ago, I can provide a little bit of nuance that to people perhaps who had an Amiga 500, want to buy an Amiga in 2023 or whenever kind of thing, but keep on hearing these oft-repeated phrases that, oh, the Amiga 3000, the best Amiga ever, and they're thinking, well, maybe that's what I should get, when maybe for their needs, because they won't be using graphics cards, sound cards, video toasters, these kinds of things, they would be just as well served with an Amiga 500 with a relevant upgrade, which would be a lot cheaper for them. So that's the kind of way that I'm looking at this. I'm not looking at this from a point of view of a collector, you know, what's desirable and so forth. I'm looking at what the average person who actually wants to buy a real Amiga would be perhaps want to consider in their purchases. So let's not labour the point anymore. We're in at number 4 today. So I'm sure this is going to upset a bunch more people, but I'm going to do this anyway. In at number 4, pop pickers, is this. It's the Amiga 1000. Oh. Yeah, okay, put down your keyboards just for a moment. Put them in your keyboard garages, people. So, why the Amiga 1000? Well, it all goes back to what I was just describing about how I'm ranking the systems. For a little while now, I can honestly say hand on heart that the Amigas that I have talked about, I have liked immensely. And the Amiga 1000 is a machine that I have a huge amount of fondness for and a great deal of respect for. But I feel that the systems I've yet to cover that appear above the ranking deserve that position based on a few merits. Why is it when I start recording that, you know, we get sirens? Let's let that go by. They're obviously after me. It's probably for wearing this baseball cap in some vain attempt to retain my youth. Okay, it's gone. So, the Amiga 1000, well, it's this very attractive looking slimline desktop PC style machine. Came out in July of 1985, but didn't really ship in any reasonable quantities until September of that year. Groundbreaking machine for its price point, fantastic graphics, fantastic sound, a multitasking operating system. Really, I mean, as most people have often talked about, the question is like, why did the Amiga not end up being more successful than it turned out being? I mean, looking at it from the perspective of Europe alone in terms of gaming, yes, the Amiga was definitely a big success in the marketplace for a while, but overall, you know, the Amiga is not something that you can go out unless you buy one of those little miniature Amiga 500s. You can't go into a shop these days and buy a brand new Amiga. So, you know, in essence, it did fade from the marketplace. So the question often repeated is, why did the Amiga fail? Now, I'm not going to recount all of that because there are plenty of videos already on YouTube of people who have covered the subject exhaustively, reading from Wikipedia, and also some people have done their own research as well, with their own opinions and so forth. Gosh, there are some real Wikipedia readers out there on YouTube, but seriously speaking, I don't want to recount what's been done 1,000 times before. See what I did there? And and been done very well by other people. I'll put a few links in the video description of videos that I recommend on the subject, so go and check those out. Instead, what I want to do is add a bit of nuance, a slightly sideways look at things, talk about a few things that people just don't tend to talk about, and add a few bits of my personal experience. So, why have I put the Amiga 1000 in at number 4 and not higher up the list? Well, it all comes down to, in 2023, its overall usability for what the majority of Amiga users are going to want to do with their systems. So, the key thing with the Amiga 1000, along with the West German Amiga 2000 models, the original 80,000s, this machine is ostensibly limited to 512 kilobytes of chip RAM. This is a limitation due to the type of Agnus chips that these machines use. They can't address anymore, and so far there have been no ways to basically create like a new Agnus chip, shall we say, that will fit into the sockets that these machines feature that would allow more chip RAM. And this becomes important if, say for example, you want to use something called WHD load, which allows hard disk installation of games that never really supported it, which is the vast majority of the Amiga games library. So it does make it a little bit more limited. Of course, obviously you can put a Gotek into one of these machines or externally, and that'll be fine because a lot of Amiga games will run fine from 512 kilobytes of chip RAM, but it's a little bit slower and not as versatile as some of the other machines I've yet to feature, or indeed some of the machines I've already featured, so that does weigh heavily. Also, this does mean if you're looking to pick up an Amiga for creating music, you're going to have more limited RAM for creating sound samples and storing them in memory, which is what needs to happen if Paula's going to play them back. Something to consider. Also, if you're into creating animation, for example, that 512k chip RAM is going to be a bit of a limitation, but it's not the end of the world. And there are other solutions to exceed that, which involve basically major surgery on these machines. The other fact that I've included in this is that this is becoming a more expensive machine, and has been for a while. Gone are the days when I could browse ebay.com on the internet at the end of the 90s, and you could see complete Amiga 1000s in the US going for like maybe $100 with a monitor and all the rest of it. Those days are long gone. So you're going to pay a pretty penny for these, and there are other solutions out there if your main requirement is to do a bit of Dualex Paint, perhaps a bit of Octamed or Pro Tracker, and playing games. There are other options out there if you're not particularly fixated on having an Amiga 1000. The other reason that I've put this in at number 4 is that this is the only Amiga model, with a slight exception to the early Amiga 3000s, that boots Kickstart, that's the Amiga's kernel, from disk. And by disk I mean floppy disk. This is mostly in part because the operating system was not really finished at the time of launch, was very buggy, and this is a way of getting around the issue of having to replace ROM chips in machines that had already been sold. Of course, this does mean that on unmodified machines you can only boot up to Kickstart 1.3 on these machines, which for some people might be a bit limiting, but also it means that you've always got to keep that floppy disk handy. There are some expansions that allow you to boot Kickstart from flash memory. The Parcero is a really good solution for this, the Parcero 2. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. A few of my Twitter followers, hello Dan and Daniel, advised me about this wonderful upgrade that allows you to plug it into the side of an Amiga 1000. It gives you extra RAM, not chip RAM sadly, but extra fast RAM, which is great for the CPU, speeds the machine up a little bit. You get an SD card for basically using as a hard disk, and if you swap out a couple of power chips on your Amiga 1000's motherboard or daughter board, I'm not sure which it is, so I'm not going to pretend that I know. You swap these power chips out and it will allow you to load a Kickstart image into the Parcero's flash memory, and then it will behave like any other Amiga, booting up straight away into either the insert disk screen or from a hard disk, inverted commas, or SD card. So a really, really nice upgrade. So, and there are other options that are out there. There's things like the Rejuvenator, and if you want to find out more about these options, I think the best person that I can refer to you is Amiga Love. He has an amazing website, amigalove.com. Go and check it out. I would probably suggest it's pretty much the ultimate Amiga 1000 resource. He loves his Amiga 1000 and not without good reason. And I think really, if you want to find out more about the machine, go and check that website out. You know, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I am a perfect authority on this machine. So, but there are things that I do know about it that I can offer as unique information in this video. So, let's get on with that. So, reasons for why I feel that the Amiga 1000 just didn't quite hit the mark at the time of launch. This could be contentious, so let's dive in. I can honestly say, hand on heart, the Amiga 1000 is possibly the best looking Amiga, although I do have a great soft spot for the Amiga 600, but maybe I'm in a minority there. But I think definitely it's in, you know, certainly the top two, depending on which way the wind's blowing that day. And it was manufactured under contract by Sanyo here in Japan, because that's where I live. And yeah, it was the only Amiga that was actually manufactured in Japan. Obviously, some components came over from the US from MOS or MOS Technologies, you know, chips and so forth. But the actual manufacturing was done by Sanyo under contract. So they're pretty well built, being Japanese, although the plastic sometimes with age have yellowed and may slightly distorted. The machine has been opened up quite a lot. But let me go into some of those reasons why I feel the Amiga 1000 was just so close to being absolutely perfect. And one of these, unfortunately, I think was an unavoidable problem despite what I would wish for. Number one, I feel that as a desktop machine, it is beautiful, but it does have limited expansion capability. It does have the side expansion ports, which is an 86-pin connector. Some people have just called this Zorro 1. It's the same connector that's on the side of an Amiga 500 or 500 Plus, but just the other way around. And this did provide a great array of expansion potential, but obviously externally. So eventually we started seeing CPU upgrades, hard disk controllers, even big boxes that provided Zorro 2 slots, which was the expansion system that featured in the Amiga 2000 first. And, you know, they obviously provided a expansion pathway, but a little bit ugly. It would have been just so wonderful if this machine just had even just one or two expansions in there, but maybe back in those days, the Zorro expansion cards were very big. They're basically the size of a full-length ISA card, and those are big beasts, and this is a pretty compact machine, but nonetheless, there's a little bit of me that just thinks, I just wish that expansion connector was somehow internal, so that maybe somebody could have created a versatile expansion card that contained a hard disk controller, an extra RAM, but hey-ho, it is what it is. So, and I think that that is something that basically puts this in at number 4 rather than number 3, because there is another machine that I've not talked about yet, which at the time of launch was arguably the worst designed big box Amiga system, but makes more sense in this day and age for some very specific reasons I'll go to in this video. But it's that limited expansion capability that slightly didn't sit a little bit, but it is what it is. Internally, I mean, I think, yeah, it had a lot of potential, but you had to have these big boxes on the side, or some of them went over the top of the machine, and yeah, it's just a little bit of a shame. But obviously modern day expansions like the Partiero card, which I've mentioned, really nice small compact box that goes on the side, looks fantastic. So that kind of stuff I can give a resounding thumbs up for. Also, it does have a little expansion on the front here, but that is purely for chip RAM upgrades. I think all of the Power machines came fitted with a 256K chip RAM expansion card, but some of the NTSC machines don't have that. So if you're buying one, just check if it's got that expansion, because you might have some trouble tracking one of those down these days. Otherwise, you'll have even less chip RAM, 256K, the only Amiga that came with that little chip RAM on the motherboard. So the expansion capability is one of the reasons why I have just slightly put this lower down in my overall ranking. The other thing that I feel that the Amiga 1000 really lacked, and the Amiga as a whole really lacked, but particularly in 1985, was a flicker-free square pixel monochrome screen at launch in 1985. Yes, the Amiga had stunning graphics for its price point at launch, undisputed. You know, it knocked the IBM PC compatible and the Macintosh out of, you know, well, blew them out of the water. That's a phrase, isn't it? So, but I feel that the lack of a true square pixel monochrome flicker-free screen dinted its potential for productivity, because regardless of the colour counts, flickering screens are painful to work on for a long period of time. And this is something that the Atari ST didn't have a problem with, because you could buy a nice monochrome flicker-free screen for that, which is one of the reasons why the ST made a good impression on music studios with its built-in MIDI ports, particularly in Europe, because you could buy a cheap ST, you could plug in all your MIDI peripherals straight out of the box essentially, and you could buy the monochrome monitor and you could get a nice high resolution screen to run Steinberg and later Cubase on. Sadly, on the Amiga, you either had to run your applications in lower resolutions, which could mean not square pixels, but no flicker, or you had to put it into high-res interlace, which would flicker, and as you all know, hopefully, PAL and NTSC pixels are not technically square. They're either slightly too tall in NTSC, or in PAL they're slightly squashed. So it doesn't make a huge difference, but it's a difference nonetheless. And I feel if the Amiga 1000 had that flicker-free monochrome screen, it may have had a better chance of establishing itself in the markets where the Macintosh carved out a niche for itself, which has basically put it in good stead until this day and age. Because in that case, a bit of serendipity saved the Macintosh, because it wasn't selling well. In early 1985, the Macintosh sales were falling and it was causing a big problem for Apple. But that serendipity went all the way back to those days when Apple and Steve Jobs went to Xerox PARC, saw some fascinating ideas such as the WYSIWYG interface, and essentially took those ideas and copied them into the Lisa and then the Macintosh system operating system. Yes, particularly people on YouTube are going to love me.
Now you won't stop talking.
Anyway, so the other thing that was gleaned from Xerox PARC was the LaserJet, the laser printer. And whilst these were huge beasts at the time, the potential was seen. And over time, another few things fell into place. One of those was a small company called Adobe was proposing to create a language that could be interpreted by laser printers and other printers to reproduce full page layouts and so forth for, you know, sort of print publications. And this standard was called PostScript. And what Apple did was they invested a small amount of money relatively into Adobe to complete the PostScript standard. And so this happened. Concurrent to this, they worked with creating the laser writer printer. I believe it was based off of some Canon technology. But this could obviously interpret PostScript, and alongside that, Aldus was started and built up the funds through venture capital to create a small product known as PageMaker. And all these things came out at the same time. And what this presented to the buyer was a viable option for desktop publishing, something that just did not exist before. And whilst the laser writer was an expensive proposition, you could connect this to, I believe, up to 16 Macintosh computers, meaning that the overall cost of this thing actually went down, and it was basically carved out a niche that just didn't exist before, desktop publishing. And of course, this changed the fortunes for the Macintosh. These four things: the Macintosh itself, the laser writer, Aldus PageMaker, and PostScript. What more can you say? From that, further applications were developed for the Macintosh, which went hand in hand with its DTP niche, such as Freehand from Aldus, and later Adobe themselves would go on to create Photoshop, Illustrator, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Amiga 1000, or the Amiga as such, however, had a huge amount of potential. So much potential. But what to do with it? And I feel that One of the problems that the Amiga had was the lack of that screen mode, which would allow for flicker-free DTP, for example. But the other thing is the operating system. Now, I think most people can agree that Amiga OS was very much ahead of its time for its price point. You know, it could do multitasking, it offered a graphical user interface, as well as a command line interpreter. But one of the things that a lot of people forget is that in 1985, Amiga OS was very unstable. It could crash. You could do simple operations such as dragging icons in certain conditions could lock the system up. And so Amiga OS had a bit of a rocky start in the marketplace. The file system, original file system, was flaky. Disks were prone to corruption. And this would not be resolved until the fast file system was launched with Amiga OS 1.3 in 1988. And these little facets of the Amiga's history are sometimes overlooked. A lot of it looks at Commodore's business decisions. But as powerful as the Amiga operating system was... oh, there's the 12 o'clock chime. Well-timed video, Vicky. Well-timed. So yes, there was an issue with stability of some of the Amiga's operating system components. But on top of this, and this is possibly unpopular because nostalgia being what it is, I'm no fan of that blue and orange look and feel that the original Amiga OS up until and including 1.3 had. Now, obviously, everybody's heard the story that it was blue and orange because it was developed to work as good as possible on the worst TV that you could buy. But I just don't understand this, that Commodore was pitching the Amiga as basically a revolutionary computer for the creative mind, I think was the slogan. And yet they were pitching the overall operating system's look and feel to work at least half reasonably on the worst TV. Why make your entire operating system environment look so wacky for the lowest common denominators? Surely you want to punch up and make this machine really sing. You know, you want to be able to say that, yeah, you can run it on a TV. But if you buy one of our 1080 monitors, it'll look really nice, you know, and actually, you know, make it look as good as possible on that. It just doesn't really make any sense to do that, to punch down so hard and wrap up your powerful operating system in a Terry's chocolate orange.
Chocolate oranges are available from Rawlinson's.
Okay, yeah.
Just what were they thinking? So, some people are very nostalgic about blue and orange. I'm not one of them. Another thing that the Amiga operating system at this stage really showed was a lot of idiosyncrasy. And I think that stems from the very shallow development team that the Amiga's operating system had. A lot of components of it were developed by essentially one person. For example, we had Dr. Tim King, who ported Tripos to the Amiga as Amiga DOS, and that replaced the original Commodore Amiga operating system project, which really was just the disk operating system. It wasn't the graphical user interface. That was like Intuition and graphics library and all this kind of stuff, which was already in hand. But, you know, that was essentially a one-person project to port that over. I'm sure other people did help as well as time went along with that. But also, you know, like, you can see it in the user interface. There are just wild inconsistencies that, you know, have a look at some of the buttons. If you look at the font editor, the preferences editor, the icon editor and notepad, they all use different graphical elements for, like, radio buttons and this kind of stuff. And it just all looks a bit amateurish, if I'm honest. It hadn't had that proper peer review to make sure, oh, your file open requester needs to be consistent across all of these applications, not having all these different things. And this speaks to the fact that the Amiga operating system until release 2 did not offer standard libraries for certain things which would allow for a consistent user interface experience. And one of those things was file open and save requesters. Now, third-party solutions like the ARP library, Rectals library, and many, many others came along, but they required applications to bundle these libraries or users to get them off of Fredfish disks, otherwise the application wouldn't run, and then you'd have different requesters in different applications. It just led for a very wacky, idiosyncratic operating system environment, and whilst you could definitely make the argument that the Macintosh system software looked a bit bland, it did at least look professional. It was consistent on the whole, and it looked pretty good in monochrome. Whereas Amiga's operating system just had so much power, but being wrapped up in this Terry's chocolate orange with all these slightly weird and wonderful user interfaces across all the different applications just made it very inconsistent for the user. And you can listen to, Amiga development conference recordings from back in the late 80s where developers are describing this frustration that we have to constantly reinvent the wheel to do standard stuff. And it made applications bigger, meaning that they had to ship more disks potentially with their application software, had to reinvent the wheel. It just was a bit haphazard, and I feel that, because there wasn't a big enough team working on the Amiga operating system software, it really showed through. It took until about 1990 with Release 2 for the Amiga's operating system to really get the spit and polish that it really deserved. It really allowed the power of the system to shine because it had a lot more built-in libraries in Kickstart, such as GAD tools, ASL library, put down your MSN Messenger, folks. I think it just stands for Amiga Standard Library or something like that. I don't know. But basically, a lot of these things that, developers really needed were not really put in place until Release 2. And you can see the idiosyncrasies. Basically, if you actually look at the APIs for, say, Intuition Library, they're very limited in many respects, which led to basically Release 2 dumping a lot of the original structures that were in place for declaring windows and screens, and we ended up with things like new menus, new screens, new window structures, which allowed much more extensibility and so forth through things like Boopsy, which was the basic object-orientated program, something that essentially was object-orientated extensibility for Amiga application software within C, which is obviously not an object-orientated language, that would be C++, but there was a lot of things that came about with Release 2, such as DOS library being finally mostly ported over to C rather than its BCPL origin, which really made the operating system so much more robust. But I think, unfortunately, by 1990, when this debuted with the Amiga 3000, the boat had pretty much already sailed. And sadly, it was from this period onwards that we started seeing some of the best looking Amiga application software. PageStream 2 ended up with a really nice OS2 compliant user interface. Final Copy 2 looked amazing, even on 1.3, had a wonderful interface for a word processor on the Amiga and worked really fast on the 68000. Scalable fonts as part of the operating system didn't become a part of it until Release 2. So that niche that the Macintosh had carved out with its support with PostScript, and then obviously going into scalable fonts and all this kind of stuff, built up an ecosystem that the Amiga just kind of, lacked for a long time. The printer driver situation on Amiga OS was always very, very poor. Limited to 4096 colour printing, and third-party solutions did eventually come along which, solved these problems, but, there are very many aspects of the Amiga OS that, despite all this power, just unfortunately reflected the lack of development team depth. But I don't want to get too much deeper into that, because these are some of the things that are more relevant to the entire Amiga situation rather than just the Amiga 1000. But I feel it's slightly overlooked that as powerful as the Amiga 1000 initial workbench and Amiga DOS software was, it was also prone to crashing and disk corruption. So there you have it. Just wanted to point that out. Still love it. Still think Amiga OS has some wonderful things about it, but you can't really deny those aspects of that rocky start that it had, that, it didn't really begin to start to straighten itself out until 1.2 and really 1.3. So anyway, so there's that. So I want to finish off with some of my own reflections of the Amiga 1000, and some of you will be saying, well, Vicky, you're not 40 yet, and that's true. I'm a few months off of it yet. And how can you possibly have any recollections of the Amiga 1000? Because obviously I was only 2 years old when this came out, so I'm not going to pretend or lie about things. So the first time I came across the Amiga 1000 was in 1995. And this wasn't in person. This was through Amiga Format issue 72. Now, for those of you who were still hanging around with the Amiga scene at that time, will know that this was a pretty good issue of Amiga Format for two reasons. First, Commodore had been finally sold, yay, to ESCOM. But at the time that was good news. It'd been about a year or so that we'd been in limbo, and there was a chance that the Amiga would go on. The second reason was that this issue of Amiga Format went into 10 years of the Amiga. So this was like pre-internet days for most people. So this is how we found out about all this stuff. And I didn't know a lot of stuff because I'd only got my Amiga 600 in 1993. So I had no real knowledge of the Amiga's history at this point. So I just was so looking forward to reading this issue. And so I read all the news about the Commodore sale and so forth in New York. And then went on to the 10 years of Amiga. And I was thinking, oh, it's going to go into like the first Amiga, the Amiga 500. Smallest number, first Amiga. And there it was, a black and white picture of an Amiga 1000, launched July 1985. And I'm like, what the hell is this? There was an Amiga before the Amiga 500. You know, like, anyway, so I was just like, wow. You know, I just did not know about this. And I'm sure if I'd looked through some of my old issues of Zap 64 or Amiga Format, I might have, oh look, there is something for the Amiga 1000 here. But if I looked at some of the Amiga software boxes, I would have seen Amiga 1000. But honestly, I never noticed it. I was still a bit too young at the time. I was only 12 years old. So, you know, these kind of things just kind of passed me by. But the in-person experience came about a year later at the World of Amiga Show at London Hammersmith's Novotel. And this was a great show. It was really busy. You know, Amiga Technologies was up and running. And, you know, things were beginning to look reasonably good for the Amiga after a long period of, you know, it being in the doldrums. Of course, looking back, writing was very much on the wall, and I knew it as well. I mean, the PlayStation was now out in Europe and was just going like gangbusters. Even the Saturn was doing pretty well at the time, which is something people still slightly forget, but the PlayStation just, well, yeah, it didn't take much more time for it to completely walk over the Saturn, but nonetheless, yeah, we all knew that that was going to happen. But, you know, it was a good show for Amiga users, and myself and my dad travelled the 200 miles up to London and stayed with my nan in West London in Ruislip. And I have hugely fond memories of my trips to the World of Amiga show with my dad. It was one of the few times that it was just me and my dad that would go away for the weekend. And I'd be excited for months leading up to these shows, you know, just imagining all the stuff I was going to see, save up my paper round money of what I could buy. And yeah, it was just a really fond memory of my early teenage years. And yeah, so went to this show, and there was one stand there that had an Amiga 1000. I honestly can't remember which one it was now. And I was just like, Dad, that's an Amiga 1000. That was the first Amiga. And he was just like, oh, okay, you know, like, what are you so excited about, kid? So went over. It just had Workbench on it. It wasn't really doing anything, and I sort of fiddled about with it, and sort of came away thinking like, oh yeah, that's just it's an Amiga 500, but in a desktop PC style case kind of thing. And I thought, yeah, it's cool. Anyway, so later on that day, because obviously we travelled so far to go to this show, and I wasn't going on the Sunday. This was just Saturday only thing, because we'd be driving back home on the Sunday. And we'd go around and around this show, over and over, trying to get every single morsel out of this experience. And towards the end of the day, it was probably getting to like 5 o'clock, and there was this stand which was selling second-hand Amiga discs and other little oddities like joysticks and mice, you know, peripherals. And I can imagine that the guy probably running the stand was just like, kid, go home, I want to go down the pub, you know, I've been here all day, I'm gasping for a drink. Or maybe there was some other event that was going to be going on after hours for all of the, you know, the people that were, you know, at the show attending and all this kind of stuff from Amiga Technologies, perhaps like a press conference or something like that. And anyway, I was looking through these discs and I found Lattice C, you know, the programming language, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll buy that, because I didn't have a C compiler at the time, and I thought I really wanted to learn C. Such a nerd. Anyway, so, and in there was an Amiga Kickstart disc. And I was like, Amiga Kickstart? But that's a ROM chip. Like, what's Kickstart doing on a disc? And it was obviously authentic. It had like the check mark and Amiga on it kind of thing. And it was really old, you know, you could see it had been used a lot because the label was quite grubby. And I said to the guy, I said, what's this? Why is Kickstart on a disc? And he says, oh, that's a Kickstart disc for an Amiga 1000. You need that to boot it. And I was just like, but why do you need a disc? And he says, oh, they don't have it in ROM. Again, I was like, wow, they didn't have it in ROM. So I sort of ummed and ahed, do I buy this as sort of like a little keepsake, even though I don't have an Amiga 1000, still never will. And I sort of went, nah, I don't need it. But it was clearly like the original maybe 1.1 disc, I'm going to guess, because it didn't have 1.2 or 1.3 written on it. So I said to my dad, and of course he was getting tired now, and he was probably thinking much the same thing as these guys behind like the stores, like, you want to get home, you know, and have a drink kind of thing. Well, back to my nan's anyway. And so we went over to where this Amiga 1000 was, and there was another guy there, and I said to him, I said, does this need a Kickstart disc to boot? And he was just like, yeah. So he said, look, I've got the disc here. So he sort of, I asked him to show me kind of thing. So he got the disc, turned the machine off, put the disc in. Well, he actually didn't put the disc in, turned it on, and up popped the famous Amiga, you know, insert disc screen. But instead of Amiga Workbench, it said Kickstart. And I was just like, oh my God. You know, I have never seen this before. And he put the Kickstart disc in, and then it just booted to the insert Workbench screen. And in pre-internet access days for me, this was just like revelationary. I mean, I'd upgraded my Amiga to OS 3.1 earlier on that year. Bought it from Blittersoft. And obviously myself and my dad had the experience of putting a ROM chip in the Amiga. So that's how I knew that Kickstart was a ROM thing. But I just never knew that the first Amiga booted Kickstart from a disc. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I still don't own an Amiga 1000, and hand on heart, as much as I would love one, I will never buy one for a simple reason. I do most of my Amiga stuff through emulation these days. Practically, that's the thing that works for me. And I just know that there is somebody more deserving of having an Amiga 1000 out there that will hopefully go on and use it and make music or artwork or play games on this and really just love the machine and get use out of it. For me, I always ask myself the question, is that just going to sit there and not get used? And if that's the answer to my question, I don't buy it. And so that's just my own collecting principles. I'm not saying that you should hold them, but I'd much rather that the Amiga 1000 that I may end up purchasing was rather used by somebody who is going to love it and use it. Anyway, what did you think of my, Amiga 1000 commentary? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Tell me down in the comments. Do you think that the blue and orange colour scheme of Amiga OS was fantastic and couldn't have been improved? I still think that really what Commodore should have done is put a little paper note in with the system saying that if you're struggling to see the screen, just change the colours in preferences. We recommend these values for high contrast. But instead, get a graphics designer to properly make the interface look nice and consistent, professional, and really make it sing. But hey, it didn't happen. There you have it, folks. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing another one of these, oh bugger, Amiga, ranking worst to best videos very soon. Guess what we're basically saying is see you soon. Peace!